While we all know the story of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and the eventual abolition, there is a sinister chapter that has been left out of our history books. With the abolition of the slave trade, a new and deeply disturbing aspect emerged: sex farms and slave breeding farms. Today, we'll uncover 10 disturbing facts that shed light on the unimaginable hardships and inhumane treatment endured by these enslaved women. This dark period reveals the shocking reality of how their bodies were exploited, their families torn apart, and their humanity stripped away. But before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button to stay on this channel for more content like this. Fact number 1. Enslaved women gave birth to their first child at a very young age. It typically started around the tender age of 13 when they were still just kids. And by 20, the enslaved women would be expected to have 4 or 5 children. This cruel exploitation was carefully planned to make sure they had as many childbearing years as possible, leading to a higher number of slaves to meet the constant demands of the plantation economy. Slave owners forcefully pushing young enslaved women into early motherhood was a cruel tactic to maintain their wealth. These women were denied any semblance of a childhood or adolescence. Their innocence was stolen, and their bodies were subjected to the harsh realities of childbirth before they had even reached adulthood. They were burdened with having multiple children without any care for their health or feelings. Fact number 2. Some female slaves were forced to have sex with their own male relatives. During slavery, some female slaves faced a heartbreaking reality. They were sexually abused by their own male relatives who were also enslaved. Systematic breeding of slaves often forced incest upon slave families. Slaves were given hoods or bags over their heads to keep them from knowing who they were having sex with. It could be someone they know, perhaps a niece, aunt, sister, or their own mother. The breeders only wanted a child that could be sold. This terrible practice deeply harmed slave families and shattered their emotional boundaries within the family due to forced incest. Fact number 3. To encourage childbearing, some population owners promised enslaved women their freedom after they had produced 15 children. In some cases, if an enslaved woman successfully gave birth to a certain number of children, the owner might make a promise of granting her freedom. One slave trader from Virginia even boasted that his successful breeding policies enabled him to sell 6,000 slave children a year. Sometimes, enslaved women wouldn't even get freedom by doing this. Some enslaved women were told that if they produced a significant number of children, they would be rewarded a chance to work in less labor-intensive roles within the plantation. These promises, though rarely fulfilled, were used to manipulate and motivate women to bear more children. Fact number 4. Even in pregnancy, enslaved women would be treated inhumane. In these slave breeding farms, pregnant enslaved women endured inhumane treatment, facing risks to their health and to the health of their unborn children. They were required to continue their labor-intensive tasks, such as working in the fields without regard for their pregnancy or physical well-being. Pregnant enslaved women were often denied proper nutrition and medical care, leading to high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. The lack of proper prenatal care and medical attention contributed to an increased risk of birth complications and premature labor. Additionally, pregnant enslaved women were not provided with rest or accommodations to support their pregnancy. Instead, they were expected to maintain their regular workload, leading to physical strain and exhaustion. Fact number 5. Enslaved women were punished for failing to conceive. Enslaved women who faced difficulties in conceiving or experienced repeated miscarriages were subjected to even more unimaginable suffering. The inability to bear children was viewed as a severe drawback by the cruel and profit-driven plantation owners. These women were considered unproductive in the eyes of their oppressors, which meant they were deemed less valuable and, as a result, faced harsh punishments and mistreatment. Slave women who did not or could not bear children would not be given any breaks or rewards that were given to mothers, and they would do the same work on the level of men. Fact number 6. The offspring produced on breeding farms were separated from their families and sold as soon as they were born. Once an enslaved woman gave birth to her child, the plantation owners or traders would immediately separate the newborn from its mother. This heart-wrenching process was often carried out when the child was still a baby, adding to the emotional trauma experienced by both mother and child. The enslaved mothers were left devastated, unable to protect or care for their own flesh and blood. Slave children were viewed as lucrative business opportunity, and their early separation from their mothers ensured that they could be trained and molded for their intended roles as slaves on different plantations. The plantation owners had no regard for the emotional bonds between mother and child, solely focusing on the financial gains that could be obtained by selling the offspring. Fact number 7. Female slaves were forced into sexual relationships with their owners or overseers. Female slaves were not only forced into sexual relationships for breeding purposes, but also as victims of sexual exploitation by their owners and overseers. This horrific practice was shockingly prevalent throughout the American South and added yet another layer of cruelty to the already dehumanizing experience of slavery. Enslaved women had no control over their bodies or their lives. They were treated as mere property, with no rights or agency to protect themselves from the constant threat of sexual abuse. Owners and overseers who held significant power and authority over the lives of these women shamelessly exploited their vulnerable positions to satisfy their own desires. Fact number 8. Women who resisted were punished severely. During slavery, female slaves who refused to bear children for their owners faced harsh punishments, both mental and physical. These punishments were designed to break their spirit and force compliance with the slave owner's wishes. Mental punishments were often employed to instill fear and obedience in these women. Slave owners would use psychological abuse, humiliation, and threats to control them. This could include verbal harassment, demeaning remarks, and constant reminders of their status as mere property. Physical punishments were also common and could be incredibly harsh. These women would be subjected to severe beatings, whipping, or other forms of physical abuse. The intention was to instill fear and pain to force them into submission. The punishments would be carried out in public to serve as a warning to other enslaved individuals not to resist their owners' demands. Fact number 9. Some plantation owners offered rewards to enslaved men who could impregnate the most women. Plantation owners would sometimes encourage competition among enslaved men, pitting them against each other to impregnate as many women as possible. Such competitions not only harmed the enslaved women who were forced to participate, but also fostered a toxic environment among the enslaved men. The offspring born from this were often sold as soon as they were weaned, resulting in the separation of families and further dehumanization of the enslaved population. Fact number 10. Enslaved women on sex farms often received poor nutrition and health care, resulting in high rates of infant mortality. While fertile women were considered valuable for breeding more slaves, their living conditions were no better on these farms. Forced to work long hours in the fields, these women were unable to care properly for their babies, leading to malnourishment and sickness among the infants. The lack of access to proper medical care further contributed to the tragic rates of infant mortality during that time. I hope you guys liked the video. A lot of time has gone in researching this topic, so we would appreciate it if you could show your support by hitting the subscribe button.